Hi everyone, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. Today we have Mellissa Meisels from Yale. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and she's also affiliated with the Institution for Social and Policy Studies and the Center for the Study of American Politics. Her research centers on the US Congress, money in politics, electoral campaigns, and political organizations. And much of this work investigates the strategic choices of candidates and financial contributors in congressional campaigns with an emphasis on primary elections. And so to explore these questions, she uses original data, natural language processing, causal inference tools, experiments, and structural estimation. And her research is forthcoming or published in PNAS, Journal of Politics, British Journal, so all the best places. So it's a real pleasure to have Mellissa join us, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for that really nice introduction and for the invitation to present here. It's great to meet all of you. So you all can see my screen, hopefully. Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
looks great.
Great. So I'll be sharing a paper which is published as a short article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that Rohan indicated that maybe you all were interested in, called Strategic Campaign Attention to Abortion Before and After Dobbs. So as Rohan said, I just started as an assistant professor at Yale. So as many of us probably know, up until recently, United States abortion law was really governed by the Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade from 1973. This established a trimester-based framework for abortion rights in the US, specifically mandating that the right to an abortion be protected throughout the first trimester, which is about up until 13 weeks. And so, what this meant across the states was that the absolute most restrictive law that could be instituted could only begin limiting the right to an abortion beginning in that second trimester. And in 2022, also, as many of you likely know, the US Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, essentially overturning the federal protections of abortion that it had previously established in Roe. And so, in particular, this had implications for that previous protection of the right to an abortion in the first trimester. And so, it essentially eliminated that, which meant that across states, specifically states um, that likely desired a more restrictive abortion policy in the absence of Roe, it meant that they could then restrict abortion however they saw fit in ways that were previously inconsistent with the law under Roe. And this was really in line with the Republican Party in the US's longstanding opposition to abortion, kind of seeking to further limit abortion across states where Republicans had quite large majorities, but they simply were not able to institute those laws due to the previous framework under Roe. So I think that it's safe to say that after this Dobbs decision was first leaked and then published publicly, the ensuing reaction was relatively negative in the court of public opinion, we could say. So there was extensive coverage of opposition to the decision, as well as just kind of opposition to overturning Roe in general, as well as a lot of circulation of statistics highlighting the incongruence between the Dobbs decision and the fact that the majority of public opinion in the US does appear to support legal abortion access in ways that are potentially inconsistent with some of the laws that Dobbs then enabled to be passed in certain states. And interestingly, and kind of in contrast with a lot of other public opinion changes following salient Supreme Court decisions, perception of support for abortion rights actually increased after the decision. Typically, public opinion updates in the direction kind of consistent with the court after a landmark decision. This kind of went the opposite. And so this means that after Dobbs, people actually perceived that there was greater support for abortion rights than they previously thought. And electorally, it subsequent research, as well as just kind of anecdotal media reports, suggested that both the decision in early 2022, as well as the subsequent presence of abortion related ballot measures, were thought to have harmed Republicans in 2022, particularly Republicans that were appearing on the same ballot, right, as these abortion measures, which even in relatively Republican leaning states or swing states, seem to support the right to an abortion. So, while there has been quite a lot of media coverage and subsequent scholarly research on kind of mass public reactions to and electoral consequences of the Dobbs decision, we know much less about whether and how elite behavior strategically updated after the Dobbs decision. There were some media reports of candidates kind of downplaying abortion or playing it up more, but we don't have a systematic idea of how specifically campaign attention to abortion changed after this landmark decision. And so, in my mind, there are two aspects of the decision that have implications for candidate strategies, given what we know in the political science literature. So, first, we know that Dobbs increased the importance of the issue of abortion to voters in the wake of the decision and increased its salience in the minds of those who intended to turn out to vote. And we know that candidates are incentivized to kind of ride the wave of public opinion in that they should want to appear responsive, right, to voters' top concerns. If they're, blatantly ignoring an issue that's on all voters' minds, it doesn't say something very positive about how in touch the candidate is, for instance. And then given the electoral outcomes and the widespread negative media coverage of the public opinion, the extent of the unpopularity of Republicans' positions on abortion were, we could say, revealed more fully after Dobbs, where there was very clear dissatisfaction with the new status quo that the decision put into place, which was, of course, aligned with longstanding goals of the Republican Party. And kind of logically, right, what we would expect, candidates are expected to benefit more from focusing on the issues on which they enjoy an advantage in the court of public opinion compared to the other parties. So, if a party has a very favorable position on a given issue, that should probably be an issue that they focus on. Whereas, if they know that they're disadvantaged on a particular issue, they might stand to benefit from kind of ignoring that issue and focusing on others. And so, when we take these two factors together, we can see that post-Dobbs, Democrats were probably straightforwardly incentivized to increase their attention to abortion, right? We know that this issue is very salient to the public, and they probably updated positively about how well voters were aligned with their position on the issue of abortion after Dobbs. On the other hand, Republicans were probably more cross-pressured, right? Because this issue did become more salient. It's kind of glaring that candidates should be addressing this topic in subsequent elections. But on the other hand, they have since the decision kind of learned that their position is maybe more unpopular than they believed previously. So, one of the reasons that we do not have a lot of research on how elites were strategically updating after the Dobbs decision is we just don't have much widespread data that can speak to specifically candidates' campaign priorities. And so, here I draw on an original collection of US House candidates' primary campaign platforms from their websites. And here, my target population is the entire universe of candidates who ran for the US House in any major party primary from 2016 to 2024. So, 5 House election cycles. That's just over 7,000 candidates. And since this is a data workshop, I thought I would spend just a second kind of showing you how I collected this. This is not a very fancy way of collecting data, probably in comparison to what some of you all are doing in your own work, but it did give me very good insight into how these campaign platforms looked, can answer many questions about how campaign websites appeared, the other kinds of issues that candidates were campaigning on. So I began by doing a very basic kind of search for a candidate's website as it appeared immediately before the date of their primary. So my representative here in New Haven, Connecticut is Rosa DeLauro. So if I were looking for her website in 2022, I did a search for Rosa DeLauro for Congress 2022. Typically very clear to find this campaign website. For those who are in office, this would not be the one ending in .gov, their official congressional website. I was looking for their campaign website, which is always separate. And then once I identified their campaign website, I then looked for their issue or policy platform. This was also typically very easy to find, clearly delineated. In the case of Rosa DeLauro, she has a subpage called Issues. This might also say something like My Platform or My Values, something like that. And then once I identified that issue platform, I would then scrape all of the text associated with all of the issues on which they chose to campaign in that year. So, for instance, you can see here Rosa DeLauro's part of her stance on the issue of seniors, and then just scraping that raw text as well. So I have all of the information on their position taking in that year. So, in these platforms, I'm seeking to identify attention to a number of issues. One, of course, being abortion, but then we also can identify attention to some other issues over the concurrent period to kind of serve as a pseudo baseline or pseudo placebo, just to see what trends were happening linearly to make sure that we're not just picking up on, for instance, candidates becoming more issue centric across time or something like that. And so I used a very simple dictionary string matching technique to identify what issues were being campaigned on. So I would just create a very small collection of dictionary terms that would suggest to me that a candidate has chosen to devote attention to a given issue. So for an issue like guns, these would include terms like gun, guns, shooting, firearm, things like that. Just things that would probably only appear in the platform if the candidate is choosing to dedicate a portion of their campaign platform to the given issue. And so I focus here on abortion and seven other issue areas. We can see that candidates were overall campaigning on abortion pretty frequently compared to other issues. It looks about divided equally among Democrats and Republicans, but of course, this is pooling over the entire period, so both pre and post Dobbs. And given the temporal scope of the data, here I have three elections that are completely pre-Dobbs. So that would be 2016, 2018, and 2020. And then the 2022 election, given that I was capturing primary candidates' platforms, essentially occurred during the Dobbs decision, as we had some primaries in some states that had already occurred even before the decision was leaked, and then a large number of primaries that also did occur after, but really occurred kind of concurrently. And then we have the 2024 election, which was fully post-Dobbs. So first, we can look at just the share of candidates that chose to campaign on the issue of abortion in each of these five election years. So first, looking at Republicans here, this red line, we can see that it was pretty constant campaigning on abortion, always over 50%, at least up until 2024. And in fact, more Republicans were choosing to campaign on abortion than Democrats across these pre-Dobbs elections. And Democrats' attention to abortion was kind of trending relatively upward, we could say, before the Dobbs decision. And then after the Dobbs decision, really increasing substantially in 2022 and especially 2024. And then for Republicans, 2024 appears to be the only time that less than half of Republican candidates were campaigning on the issue. We really see this anomalous dip in the proportion of Republicans campaigning on abortion, whereas it was relatively stable and slightly increasing before. And then we can look at our just comparison of these other issues, and we don't see trends that are, I would say, strongly suggesting that candidates in, for instance, Democrats in 2024 were just much more issue focused and campaigning more on every issue. It does seem like these trends are relatively relegated to the issue of abortion. And then because we have our textual data here, of course, we can think about how candidates' actual rhetoric around abortion was perhaps changing. So something that I was interested in looking at is whether the explicit usage of the term abortion increased or decreased among these candidates over the period. There's anecdotal evidence suggesting that Democrats, at least in previous elections, were explicitly advised not to use the term abortion because it's very polarizing. It tends to have a negative connotation. And so this is the share of candidates who chose to campaign on abortion that actually use the term explicitly. And so, for instance, we can see before 2022, right, well under 50% of Democrats who are choosing to campaign on the issue of abortion are even using the term verbatim. So that means that they would have only been using more illusory terms like reproductive rights, right to choose, things like that. And then although this was increasing perhaps slightly before the Dobbs decision, in 2022 and 2024, we see really large increases in the share of Democrats who are choosing to campaign on abortion with this explicit term. And kind of consistent with that guidance toward Democratic candidates to not use the term, before 2024, it was much more prevalent for Republicans to use the more negatively charged term abortion. And then by 2024, there was actually a larger share of Democrats campaigning on abortion who chose to use the term verbatim than Republicans. And this was certainly not the case before 2024. So now we can look a little bit more formally at just how Dobbs appeared to change campaign attention to abortion. So, what was kind of the magnitude of these changes before and after the Dobbs era? So, I'll be running linear probability models here that are estimated separately by party, so separately for Democrats and Republicans, as well as by issue. So, either the issue being abortion or the other kind of placebo or baseline issues. So, in total, running four regressions in order to compare the coefficients from each. My level of observation in the data set is candidate year issue. So for each candidate in a given election year in which they ran, I know whether or not they campaigned on a particular issue. And so this means that for each of the candidates that are in my data set, they're going to have eight separate observations for each issue in every year that they ran. The key outcome variable here is going to be whether a particular candidate did in fact campaign on that particular issue in a certain election year. And then my key explanatory variables are just a dummy variable for whether the observation was in 2022, whether it was in 2024, and then given these independent variables, the omitted category here is going to be that pre-Dobbs period of 2016 to 2020. So given the four regressions that we're running, we're going to be able to see whether Democrats became more likely to campaign on the issue of abortion in 2022 or 2024 compared to the pre-Dobbs period, as well as whether Republicans became more or less likely to campaign on it in 2022 and 2024, and then looking at those analogous trends across other issues to just see if this is kind of an overall issue-focused phenomenon or something relatively specific to abortion. And then I'll be clustering my standard errors at the candidate level. So, looking at the change in campaigning on abortion in 2022 compared to the pre-Dobbs period, we can see that Democrats were, in fact, substantially more likely to campaign on the issue of abortion in 2022. For Republicans, if anything, this coefficient, right, is positive. It's not quite statistically significant at traditional levels. And we can see when we have these kind of placebo other issues that there does appear to be an increase in just kind of issue attention in general among Republicans. So it doesn't really seem like Republicans are meaningfully increasing campaign attention to abortion in 2022. But for Democrats, this is kind of a real increase. And then by 2024, interestingly, there's an even larger increase in Democrats' attention to abortion, right, compared to that pre-Roe period. And then Republicans are actually reducing their attention to abortion in 2024 compared to those earlier periods. And then for our kind of placebo issues, we have effects that are estimated to be very close to zero. It wasn't the case that before the Dobbs decision, states had consistent laws that that are regarding kind of what would happen if a decision like Dobbs was passed. A large number of states in the US have laws in place that were frequently referred to as trigger laws, where they had a law on the books that stated explicitly if Roe v. Wade is overturned, this law banning abortion will immediately kick in. Some other states actually just had pre-Roe laws that would have been set to take precedent if Roe had been overturned kind of implicitly. The trigger law states are those in hot pink here. The light pink states are those that just had those pre-Roe laws that would have had a similar effect. And then brown states are those that had both. And so there was kind of variation in the existing law that would have immediately taken precedent in response to a decision like Dobbs. And so we can also look at whether these changes in the partisan divergence in attention to abortion was driven most strongly by candidates that were running in these states that had bans set to immediately take effect upon a decision like Dobbs. So again, I'll be running linear probability models that are estimated separately, again by issue, either abortion or a different issue, and then also by the state law status. So either whether they were running in a state that had this ban that was set to take place immediately upon Dobbs, or whether there was at least no immediate change that would have gone through automatically. And then again, we have the same level of observation, the candidate year issue that allows us to distinguish between candidates' attention on different issues. Our outcome variable here is going to be the same. So did the candidate choose to campaign on a particular issue in a certain election year? And then the key explanatory variables here instead are going to be an interaction between a candidate's partisanship, specifically Republican, with the omitted category as a Democratic candidate, interacted with our year dummies so that we're able to compare results from the regressions based on candidates in the immediate ban versus no immediate ban states to see whether these differences between Democratic and Republican attention to abortion after Dobbs increased more among candidates who were in these states that were more immediately affected by the decision. And then same candidate clustered standard errors. So what we see is in 2022, these candidates who were in states with no immediate change on the books, the differences between Democratic and Republican attention to abortion did not actually change substantially in 2022 compared to the pre-Dobbs period. Whereas among candidates who were in those immediate post-Roe ban states, there was a large increase in the divergence between campaign attention to abortion among Democrats and Republicans. So a much greater contrast in the Republican and Democratic strategies with regard to abortion in the states that were most immediately impacted by the Dobbs decision. However, by 2024, we can see that although the partisan divergence in attention to abortion increased even more between Democrats and Republicans, right, in 2024 compared to the pre-Dobbs period, there was also a major increase in the divergence between parties even among candidates who were in states that didn't have an immediate change, and perhaps, right, that could be due to laws that went into place in the intervening years, or perhaps pending laws that were kind of in question during this 2024 election. So I would say here we have pretty strong evidence that Democrats did ramp up their attention to abortion in both 2022 election and the 2024 election, whereas Republicans really de-emphasized the issue of abortion by 2024. I think that there are a number of potential explanations for why we would see these patterns. First is this question of the salience of abortion. And I would say that this cannot really explain the results because if issue salience were really the driving force, right, we would have seen candidates of both parties increasing their attention to this issue. And in fact, we just saw it from the Democratic Party. Another question is whether this is simply due to changes in the party's relative satisfaction with the status quo, right? After the Dobbs decision, Republicans would have been much more satisfied with the status quo. So maybe they just would have de emphasized this issue that they no longer care that much about, whereas Democrats would have been much more unhappy with the status quo. So it's a much more pressing issue for them. However, the fact that Republican attention to abortion only decreased by 2024 kind of suggests that this is not the case because that status quo satisfaction would have kicked in theory, immediately in 2022, at least partially in the large number of states that hadn't had their primaries yet by the time that the decision was released. And so that kind of leaves the explanation of public opinion considerations as the driving force behind these trends, especially because given the subsequent ballot measure initiatives as well as sustained negative coverage of the Republican position on abortion, it's likely that um, Republican candidates and the Republican Party in general might not have fully realized how unpopular their position was, even among people that they would think would be predisposed to agree with them until after the 2022 election. And so that could potentially explain the lag on the Republican side. And I think that the implications of these discordant strategies are relatively negative if we consider the fact that we have strong evidence of voters really prioritizing the issue of abortion after the Dobbs decision. If these kind of disparate strategies made it more difficult for voters to compare candidate stances right on one of these top issues. And maybe you're thinking, well, everyone knows that Republicans have this stance on abortion and Democrats have this stance, but there are quite a lot of voters that do not know the major parties' stances on even major issues. And if we also consider, for instance, primary voters having to compare candidates who share a partisan identification, this might have made it more difficult for them to figure out exactly where their co-partisan candidates stood on potentially one of their top issues in the subsequent elections. So thanks so much again for the opportunity to present and really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was an incredible presentation. You did such a lot of work. I'll just read out some of the questions from the chat for you to respond to. And then if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand and then I can call on you. But the first one is from Eric. And this was with regard to around about slides 4 or 5. I think you were talking through some of the websites. So is there any risk of campaign websites retrospectively changing their text? Is there any incentive for this? Did you use any caching?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what you're asking about is whether candidates would go back and essentially remove their positions on abortion. So, so this is why I was very deliberate about the point at which I was capturing these websites. So to be more clear, the websites of the candidates who ran in 2022 and 2024, I actually collected in real time, specifically in the week prior to their primary. And so even if they went back and changed that text later, which is in theory possible, but there is work showing that candidates really maintain almost all of their website text from election to election. I've looked at this in my own data as well. And even from one election to the next, right, where we have a 2 year lag, there's very little change in the text. And so it's unlikely that, for instance, candidates would be changing their rhetoric from the primary to the general election, for instance. And for candidates who ran before 2022, I did actually use the Wayback Machine, which I see that someone mentioned in the response. Amazing resource. And the Wayback Machine actually shows the appearance of a website on a specified date. And so I ensured that I was looking at how a website appeared as archived most immediately before the date of their primary. And so this would, right, even if it's not exactly the date that we would be hoping that we could find it as archived, we know exactly how a website appeared on that specified date. And so I also did take note of exactly when a given screenshot was from. Yeah, that's definitely something important to consider for data collection like this.
Melissa,
Thank
can I ask, how did you, if I remember you said a number, was there 7,000 web pages? Did you have interns helping? How did you capture 7,000 in 1 week?
Yeah, so I actually did all of the 2024 cases myself. So I did have some help, which was amazing, especially for the archived websites where there was less of a time constraint. Um, Yeah, I spent a lot of time doing this. I'm happy with how things have gone, and sometimes spending a ton of effort on things like this does pay off. But certainly, it was high risk, right? This is what I was doing as a PhD student, just a year or two ago, and so I really had to just kind of set aside all of my time to find all of these websites, especially in really large states, right, where they all, of course, have the primary on the same date. It is quite a large number of candidates. And I had some undergraduate RAs that were helping me with those archived websites where I didn't need to rely on them to like capture them on a specific date.
Thank you.
Okay, so just try and deal with a couple of more of the chat, but if anyone has any other questions after that, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. But Eric again, seeing as we've taken care of Thomas's. Eric again, and this was around about slides 11 or 12. You had just talked about your first regression and then you were moving into the second one. And Eric asked, what's the intuition for why the regression coefficient would be positive for the Republicans, given that the share of platforms with abortion fell in the first time series graph that we saw?
Yeah, so sorry, I got rid of the slides already. But so in 2022, the when I was just showing the share of Republicans who had campaigned on the issue, the share had not fallen yet. It's almost the exact same proportion of Republicans campaigning on abortion in 2022 compared to 2020. And then in previous years, it was slightly lower. So 2020 and 2022, the just raw shares were essentially identical. It wasn't until 2024 that there was a visible decrease in the share of Republicans campaigning on the issue. And so the disparity between like the relatively positive coefficient, although it's not statistically significant, would probably be due to the number of candidates that were in each that were running in each year, as I'm not looking at an explicit time series of candidates. And so in some years, we have more Republican candidates running than in others. And so that's why I think it's helpful to show just the raw percentage of candidates that were campaigning on the issue and then try to estimate things more formally.
Oh, sorry, Melissa, maybe I didn't understand, but just the graph that actually showed the first regression coefficient where the Republican one was oh, well, it was a little bit positive, but the Democrat
Yes.
went up a lot. I thought that was for
Yes.
the 2024 delta. Did I understand that correctly?
So I was plotting coefficients from 2022 and 2024 with the baseline
Uh,
compare with the omitted category in both being the 2016 to 2020 period. And so for Democrats, both in the just plot with the raw share of Democrats campaigning on abortion, it did increase substantially in 2022 and 2024, which is consistent with those positive coefficients. And then the Republican one was essentially constant across 2020 and 2022. But actually, I just realized the reason that the Republican coefficient in 2022 was slightly positive is our omitted category, right, which is the pre-Dobbs period, 2016 to 2020, because Republicans campaigned on abortion less frequently in 2016 and 2018, it's pulling over that kind of baseline comparison. And so in 2022, compared to 2016, 2018, and 2020, it was slightly higher. But as I also showed, right, that's potentially also just consistent with Republicans devoting more attention to issues in general, because that
mm.
also held relatively for other non-abortion issues.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So the final question from the chat is more of a comment, and then I'll go to Bart. And if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand. But final one from Thomas is that candidates not changing websites much, or whether or not they do, feel so interesting, and you've got the data to make a paper of it in itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. This was something that I was very interested in, right? Because we have formal models, for instance, suggesting that candidates should completely change their positions, their whole stance before and after, like a primary election. I think another kind of related question that is really set aside in a lot of my work, but that I do think is interesting is why are candidates choosing to articulate campaign platforms? Right, in the US, it's not required whatsoever that candidates actually commit to a platform in any way. These are completely discretionary websites that the candidates don't have to make. And so, why would a candidate a priori choose to kind of make these campaign promises when now they could be on the books opposing something that they end up supporting if they're elected? So, I totally agree. There's a lot of interesting descriptive stuff, some of which I focus more on in other projects.
Yeah, the title sort of writes itself, which is, like something from Keynes, where when the facts change, I change my mind. Yeah, what do you do? Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, Bart.
Thanks, Ron. Mellissa, thanks very much for your great talk. Really enjoyed it. Help me understand, like from across the border, primaries and general elections, while they're related, seem very different. I mean, the primaries, you're fighting with people in your own party to get the nod to be your representative in the general election. Have you thought about or have you looked at how would your results change if you only focused on the campaign positions of the ultimate candidates from the two parties in the general election rather than especially now, like the it seems like the things that Republicans have to do in primaries to become the candidate almost shoots them in the foot when they get to the general, depending on where they're running. So from a like I can see that sample size would be bigger, but I also kind of anticipate that the noise may be greater. Can you walk us through that? What am I missing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm just really focused on primaries in general for a number of reasons because we think that in the general elections here, there's really not much explaining kind of candidates' positions and focuses aside from just kind of general partisanship considerations and just empirically based on the platforms that I have here. So as I mentioned before, there's very little change within platform, for instance, between a primary and a general election. And so we know that there wouldn't be, for instance, much like increasing emphasis or decreasing emphasis between a primary and a general election. But for sure, if I changed the sample to just those candidates who made it into the general election, that would be quite a different sample than all of the primary candidates that I'm looking at here. I did definitely run this analysis a while ago, and of course, the sample size is quite a bit smaller. But if I recall, I think that the effects were actually relatively, in terms of the differences between Democratic and Republican strategies with regard to abortion attention, I think that the differences were even larger, which makes sense because if we think about, so I can, again, since I hand collected all this data, I can speak to, it's very clear when some of these candidates are like low quality, right? They're certainly not going to even receive a large vote share in the primary election. The candidates that are more strategic, that would be thinking more about these things, are those that are going to tend to do better in these elections and actually make it to the general election. And so I think that there appeared to be an even greater strategic consideration among those general election candidates. But it's also a little bit difficult to make comparisons just because a large number of candidates don't face like a meaningfully competitive general election in the US, especially in these later periods due to district safety. But yes, I think it is very interesting to think about like how the average primary versus general election candidate would be strategically considering these things.
Yeah, and if I can just one, and thank you very much. So you've confirmed what I would have suspected, and again, I find, and this is a Canadian looking at U.S. politics, is entertaining. The primaries are almost like an entertaining entree to the main event. But I guess the main event, and I think what you're alluding to, and I fully agree, is what is it? There's 438 districts or whatever across the US, something like that. But you could subdivide them into clearly Republican, i.e., you could run a mule and put Republican behind its name and it would get elected, versus clearly Democrat. And then you've got kind of the purple or the swing districts. And it seems to me, even looking at the data that you've described to us, and then subcategorizing each of those, I think it's 438, by and probably the past history of it, clearly always went Republican, always went Democrat, or went back and forth. I think you'd have interesting trends, even just breaking it down in that kind of three-way comparison. But hey, I'm sure that you don't need more work to do, but just a curious thought.
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, in most of my work, I do a subset, essentially all of my results to open seat winnable races for this reason, because additionally in the US, we have such strong incumbency effects. It's really not the case that most incumbents, at least at the general election stage, need to be worried about being defeated. And so most of the action really is happening in open seats for parties that are competitive or are kind of dominating the district, because that's where issues could potentially actually be important, and not just kind of the incumbent's existing record or the predetermined partisanship, especially if we're thinking about open seat primaries, which is what I've focused on in a lot of my work. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Great. Thanks very much again.
Chris.
And I'm Mellissa. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for the presentation. Sorry, I joined a bit late, but I find the presentation to be really interesting and the topic to be really interesting. I don't know if it's like I'm trying to think of how to formulate the question in a way that would fit here. You know, one of the things that I've found interesting in looking at public opinion data on abortion historically is that it always seemed to me that the sort of pro-choice side was often at least once upon a time, a larger and kind of a default position that a lot of people would have, especially, for example, among women. And the pro-life side was, kind of a smaller group in public opinion, but also a group that seemed to be really intense. Like it was a kind of a non-negotiable. I think obviously for both sides, but especially on the sort of the pro-life side of the equation. And I'm just wondering if you sort of get a sense at all in your work about whether there is still a difference between it. So where I kind of see it fitting theoretically in political behavior literature is that this kind of debate about to what degree do people's positions on core issues shape their party identities or their party choice, versus the degree to which their partisanship and party choice shapes their positions on core issues. And I've often wondered, purely speculatively, if a pro-choice position on abortion, especially in the Roe v. Wade era, wasn't, to a greater extent, one of those issues that people acquired by virtue of their partisanship alongside, a number of other issues. Whereas for a core on the kind of political right, if it wasn't a non-negotiable that actually oriented them politically. I mean, I know obviously that's to some degree true for both sides of the debate, but it just always struck me that it may not have been historically a strategic issue on the right. Like it was a completely non-negotiable under no circumstances, could it be sacrificed kind of regardless of the strategic landscape. And I'm just curious if you get any sense of that, or maybe whether it's changed, in the sort of post Roe v. Wade era, or just in general, any thoughts about the kind of the potential asymmetry on the left and the right between the intensity with which the convictions are held on this issue. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I'm not sure exactly when you came in, but one of the papers that I cited really at the beginning is this working paper by some of my colleagues here, actually, that is wading into exactly the public opinion debate that you're speaking to, which is really about partisanship, whether partisanship is shaping issue attitudes or vice versa. And they're actually using the issue of abortion post Dobbs to suggest that, at least with regard to this issue, people did feel so strongly about it, and it was such an important and salient issue to them that it actually led at least like weak partisans or maybe independents to identify more closely with the party that was consistent um, with their abortion attitude. And so I think that and other work that I cited about the increased salience of abortion after Dobbs especially kind of speaks to just how important of an issue this was to voters, it seems, in these 2022 and 2024 elections. I think your point about, we could say, perhaps the within party heterogeneity in like abortion issues is very interesting, because I think that you're right that in the Republican Party, being pro-life was kind of such a, there wasn't really another like stance that was feasible to take. And especially over the past few decades, it has become such a key Republican issue. And you might have also come after I showed this just basic graph of kind of the share of Republicans and Democrats campaigning on the issue of abortion in 2016, 2018, 2020, and then 2022 and 2024. And really until 2024, consistently every single year, more Republicans were campaigning on the issue of abortion than Democrats. And so I think that that perhaps confirms your suspicion or the public opinion evidence about like pro-life just being a more intense position, right? Because I can guarantee you, having hand collected all of these platforms, there were almost no Republicans that were running on anything other than a pro-life stance on abortion. And just anecdotally, also from my experience, there was a wider range of kind of positions taken on abortion among Democrats. I would not say that there were a lot of Democrats that were in what we could call the pro-life camp, but there was a wide range of how permissive do you want abortion law to be? How are you discussing abortion? And so, like, one of the additional results that I had was looking at the usage of the verbatim term abortion. And there were some Democrats that were using the term abortion, but it was common to just use much more kind of illusory terms like pro-choice, reproductive rights. And the usage of the term abortion did increase substantially, especially by 2024 among Democrats. But then for Republicans, they're using that term very consistently. Perhaps it's because it's a more negatively charged term, but it probably is just kind of consistent with their pro-life position. Whereas Democrats, kind of depending on the type of the district that you represent, for instance, depending on perhaps your gender identity, you would be discussing abortion in kind of different ways, even if all such candidates are kind of under the umbrella of pro-choice.
Thanks very much, Melissa.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, maybe I'll just ask one brief one, Melissa. On around about slide 10, when you're sort of introducing your models and things, why did you make the choice to run them as 4 separate models rather than, for instance, put in binary coefficients and things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I probably started out doing that, but it just gets a bit complicated to have that many interaction terms, because essentially what I'm trying to look at is, so I could have specified, for instance, the main kind of result just looking at Democrats versus Republicans increase or decrease in attention to abortion in 2022 and 2024. So I could have just replaced that with like an interaction with partisanship, like I did in that later heterogeneous effects by the state law. But I was trying to avoid like having so many interaction effects, especially because I also could have added an interaction effect for the issues, right? I could have added an issue indicator that would have been interacted with everything that would indicate whether the issue was abortion versus the other one. And so I just kind of thought that it was cleaner to present these coefficients like separately, and especially explicating things in the paper, right, which is a very short article. It's a bit easier to just explain, oh, I ran these kind of basic models separately among these four subsets rather than explain like and interpret an interaction effect. But absolutely, they would be substantively capturing the same thing. They shouldn't change the results at all. It just kind of made it a little bit easier to do more of an explicit, especially baseline comparison with the non-abortion issues, whereas that would have been implicitly baked in to the omitted category, which would be the omission of, in that case, maybe like 3 or 4 dummy variables, which can just be a little, I think people tend to get confused with interaction terms. You can do a good job of explaining them well, but I think when people need to follow a large set of variables, it can be difficult in the review process. So that was really the only reason.
Excellent. I guess final question. You have all these incredible publications in very much like political science journals, right? And then you've got this one in PNAS, which is a general science journal, general readership. Do you have any advice for folks who are looking to follow in your footsteps and maybe get one of those sort of, really high profile general science publications like PNAS, Nature, those sorts of things?
That's a good question. Yeah, thanks so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it. So I just kind of wanted to try sending this article to a journal like Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences because I thought that the timing was very relevant, right? So this just came out earlier this year, which is very close to, right, almost immediately after like the 2024 election. And my perception of, for instance, political scientists that I look up to who had previously published in this journal were that it seems that they are sending findings that are very timely, very relevant, and perhaps of broad interest to people outside the field of political science. And so, given that this is something just affecting, so many things in the United States, including things with implications for health and medicine and science, and a lot of other things that PNAS readers who are not political scientists would care about, I thought that it might be interesting to try to send it there. And another thing is that these general science journals are known for being very fast in comparison to political science journals. So if you all, especially for the grad students that are here, if you haven't sent an article to a political science journal yet, on the quick end, things take months and months and months. Things are much quicker with the general science journals. Unfortunately, that typically means you're getting a desk rejection very quickly, which is okay. It's good to get a quick desk rejection rather than a peer review rejection that took, up to 4 months, is my opinion. And so this was a very seamless process with PNAS. Of course, I'm really happy with how things turned out, but even if it had been a rejection, it just would not have taken that much of my time. The editors were really great. And so I think that if you feel that you have a finding that is really of general interest and very timely, just give it a try. It won't take too much of your time, even if it doesn't turn out how you're hoping.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. But we've just got 2 more minutes. But
It's just a quick follow-up to your question, Rowan. So, Mellissa, and I'm going to dig out the PNAS paper and have a look at it now. My curiosity has been piqued. In the discussion of that, did you dare to wade into what your results might suggest we should expect for the 2026 midterm elections?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I absolutely did not touch that in the article. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was correct and not. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I'll be collecting these campaign platforms in 2026 again. And one of the best parts of doing this year after year, even though it takes so much time, is I get to comprehensively survey the issues that candidates are campaigning on and how they're talking about them. So I guess I will be finding out relatively soon whether things are going to be following these trends. I also, just as a side note, I think the 2024 presidential election was interesting because there was so much discussion in the media of, oh, this things should be looking, very good for the Democratic candidate because of the Dobbs considerations and because it does seem that public opinion was really not on the side of the decision, and so that must be helping the Democratic presidential candidate. Of course, we can't infer from one election result like what was causing it, but we could say it was inconsistent with that kind of prediction. And so I do think that now it's more of an open question, the effects that the kinds of strategies I'm capturing would are having on electoral outcomes. And there's been a decent amount of work on electoral outcomes from 2022. Maybe we'll get some more about 2024 now that we're a little bit past it. But I'm very interested in whether effects on electoral outcomes might be durable at all and for how long.
And if you had more of the media come to you and want you to speak, I mean, you're developing this wonderful, rich database. I have to admit, when I'm watching the midterms in 2026, I won't be surprised if I see you sitting at the CNN or the
No.
MS Now desk as a pundit and expert. Thanks again. It was great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope that it's a good resource for others, and I hope to have some more findings about what's going on in the 2026 elections for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Mellissa. It was absolutely fantastic, and it's an incredible amount of work that you've done and to communicate it, and obviously a wonderful outcome with PNAS. And looking forward to having you back in a year to learn about 2026. So thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much. This was wonderful. Thanks for the
Melissa.
invitation. Great to meet all of you.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks, guys.